lectures. RoseAnne Misajon is from the School of Social Sciences, where she lectures there, and her key areas of research include subjective well-being, health-related quality of life, psychometrics and scale development, experiences of prejudice, social inclusion, and culturally diverse populations. Our other presenter this evening is Manns from the School of Languages, Literatures, Cultures and Linguistics. Howie studies language and communication within and between Australia and its new neighbours. And before joining Monash, he actually specialised in the collection and analysis of foreign language data for the US Navy. So I find that intriguing. They might introduce their co-researchers to us, and they begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. We'll actually have Muhammad Iqbal presenting with us today, and I should also acknowledge before I get started that one of our research assistants, Gide Rajak, is in the audience, and early on in the project we were working with a researcher from Australia-Indonesia named Irwan Shah. But let's go ahead and get started. Our presentation actually dovetails quite nicely off of Agnes's, and the reason is we didn't want to do necessarily another pool. What we wanted to create was a tool that could be used to identify the ebbs and flows of the Indonesian relationship. So we'll spend the vast majority of today talking about that tool, and then towards the end we thought we might include some discussions we had with people about soft power at the end of our research project, and that might lead into a stimulating discussion between all of us. In any case, let's talk about our new tool for the Australia-Indonesia relationship. As Agnes pointed out, there are numerous tools pools. We didn't want to do another one of these. What we wanted to do was create a dynamic, sustainable, and innovative tool that people can use for the Australia-Indonesia relationship. Specifically, we took something called linguistic inquiry word count. It's a text analysis tool that's based in social psychology, but also in linguistics. And this tool was developed originally for English, in English, and we translated it and developed it for the Indonesian language. Now, the tool consists of a 4,500 word dictionary, which on the one hand might seem quite low, but 4,500 words generally captures, believe it or not, about 85 to 95% of the text whenever you look at public discourse. Each word is a very time-consuming process. Each one of these words is coded across 70 linguistic and psychological categories. And what we do with this is we process big data to isolate shifts in language and collective and individual psychology. And what I mean by this is we can actually look at public text and identify shifts, but also we can look at individual essays and look at how people shift themselves. What does LOOP, this text analysis tool, capture? Well, it captures shifts in emotion or cognition in a population. In other words, what is a particular population feeling at any one time? What are they thinking? It isolates and identifies shifts in psychological concerns that a population might have, including family, religion, or social concerns. And it also reveals shifts in language, which on the surface might not seem significant, but are actually profoundly significant. For instance, we in linguistics have words called function words, which are and, but, a, the, words like that. And these shifts in the use of these kinds of words can actually hint at, firstly, the kinds of groups that might commit acts of violence, but also, more so, when those groups might commit acts of violence. That's not what we're presuming or looking at in the Indonesian case. I'm just using this as a case to illustrate that, in fact, this is something software can do. And also, emotion and cognition words in essays and also public discourse have been linked to the ability to monitor health and even mortality rates in a community. So because of this, we were keen to use it to identify the ebbs and flows in the Australian-Indonesian relationship. And a useful metaphor to these ends is that this tool actually positions stakeholders as doctors of sorts, diagnosing, and variations in and also interventions on the relationship. What do I mean by this? Well, we can ask questions around how good or bad the relationship is in comparison to the way it was before. We can look directly at whether we've done something to impact this relationship, whoever that we is. And lastly, we can use this tool to say, right, well, what does the current state of the relationship tell us about how we might intervene? So the doctrine of metaphor is actually really, really good in this way because the words that we're looking at are linked to specific parts of the brain. So emotion words are linked to the limbic system, which is in the middle there. Words related to cognition, ways of thinking, are related to the neocortex. And articles, pronouns, and prepositions, these function words, are related to this area right here, and an increase in those words indicates a likelihood that somebody will act on doing something, and nouns and adjectives in particular show that a community or individual are trying to categorize the world rather than act on it. So in short, the Luke is an MRI of sorts for public discourse on the Australian-Indonesian relationship. And it's more dynamic and timely than a poll. So, for instance, hypothetically, if somebody said something stupid on Monday, on Tuesday you might be able to measure the reaction, but perhaps later on Tuesday somebody might make a statement, and then on Wednesday you would actually be able to go in and look at public discourse and measure whether or not that statement had an impact of any sorts. I'll turn it over to Momo.
Hi everyone. So for this project we looked at two incidents involving Australia and Indonesia. First of which was a spy incident, and the second was the executions of Andrew Chan and Iqbal, which we refer to as the Bali Line executions. For each incident we gathered data from about 15 weeks prior to about 15 weeks after. So in the case of the spy incident, the news broke on the 31st of October 2013. We scraped newspaper articles from mid-July to about mid-February 2014. And in the case of the Bali Line executions, which took place on the 29th of April 2015, we scraped data from the 14th of January 2015 to the 18th of August 2015. Where did we collect data from? So we scraped data from websites of 4 different newspapers, 2 in Indonesia, 2 in Australia. In Indonesia, we scraped data from Kompas and the Jawa Post National Network. And from Australia, we scraped data from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Daily Telegraph. And we focused our attention on sections from each source that we thought would most likely mention the neighboring country. So you get your usual suspects of the international section, politics, economy, travel, and so on. For Kompas, we ended up scraping over 40,000 articles in this time period alone, and about 45,000, for both Bali Line and the spy incident, and over 45,000 articles from Jawa Post. From Sydney Morning Herald, we scraped close to 45,000 articles, and from the Daily Telegraph, we got just a little over 11,000 articles. But today we'll be focusing on the Bali Line data set. So this is what it looks like, distributed across chunks of 4-week blocks, or months to simplify things. Month 0, right in the middle, is where the event itself occurred, starting on the day the event occurred. So in this case, month 0 started on April 29, 2015. And to keep things neat and symmetrical, we'll be looking at data from 3 months prior to 3 months after. So now that we have our data set, we started to interrogate it and ask it questions. And our first question is, how often is the neighboring country mentioned? And the answer? Not a lot. So those little green strips, I don't know if you can see it, represent the articles that talk about the neighboring country. To give a bit more perspective, Kompas has an average ratio of about 1 Australia article to 25 non-Australia articles. Jawa Post has about a ratio of about 1 in 50. Sydney Morning Herald has an average ratio of 1 Indonesia article to about 19 non-Indonesia articles. And Daily Telegraph has a ratio of about 1 in 30. So zooming in a bit, you can see that there are noticeable increases during the month of the execution. minus for job posts. To no one's surprise, Sydney Morning Herald and Compass mentions the neighbouring country a lot more than Daily Telegraph and job posted. So focusing on these articles that mention the other country, the next question was how often did the issue of Bali 9 come up during the Bali 9 executions come up? And this is what that looks like. So with Compass, it consistently came up quite a bit, but never took the majority of articles about Australia with job posts. It initially took the lion's share Compass is top left, job posts is top right. So with job posts, it initially took the lion's share of the articles before tapering off. For Sydney Morning Herald and Daily Telegraph, which are the bottom two, Bali 9 executions consistently took up the majority of the Indonesia-related articles up until the month of the execution, and for pretty much everyone in the following months, it got a lot less coverage. It completely disappeared from job posts for the next 2 months, and really only Sydney Morning Herald continued to give it much attention after that. So this is just a brief outline of what the data looked like, what the data that we were looking at working with looks like. But then our next question is whether or not there are any differences within the contents of the articles themselves. And to try and answer that, we utilize LIWC, and I'll hand it back to Howie.
So, yeah, as Momo pointed out, not only can we identify where Indonesia and Australia are coming up in the other countries' newspapers, we can also identify how it's coming up and how people are orienting to the other country. So what I'm going to begin to do is I'll spell out something quantitatively that we can intuitively know, for instance, the difference between the Daily Telegraph and the Sydney Morning Herald. But then I hopefully will present a few things that are a bit more nuanced and surprising. So apologies for the big graph, but this is the difference overall between the coverage of Indonesia during the Bali 9 execution period that Momo was talking about. And perhaps not surprisingly, you see on the far right, this is statistical significance. There's a difference between the papers, not surprising. If you look under the Daily Telegraph, you can see that they cover Indonesia with more emotion. And whoops, I highlighted the wrong column there, I apologize, but that should be ever so slightly right under the Sydney Morning Herald, the cognitive processes. That means that the Sydney Morning Herald, again, big surprise, provides more in-depth analysis of Indonesia when it does refer to Indonesia. As I said, we can begin by presenting some things that quantitatively, we can present things quantitatively that we intuitively expect. The one place, oddly enough, where we see cognition coming into play with the Daily Telegraph is certainty. They're certain they're right about whatever it is that they're speaking about. Now, we can focus in, this is where things get to be a little bit interesting when it comes to the relationship. We can focus in on the Indonesian coverage during the execution period and focus in on the exact coverage of the execution and how the newspapers covered the execution. Now, what's firstly interesting here is that the Sydney Morning Herald comes more into line with the way that the Daily Telegraph covers the executions in terms of emotions. That's the first thing that stands out here, is they're covering things with, in general, equal senses of emotion, but the Daily Telegraph actually still holds the market on anxiety, so that's good for everyone. Oddly enough, though, the Sydney Morning Herald takes over a bit in terms of how they're covering certainty. The Sydney Morning Herald is becoming more certain about whatever it is they're saying. I present this, I should say, is if you go through and you were using this tool fully, you wouldn't just isolate that they had taken over the market on certainty. You would further ask some questions around why and how that might speak to how stakeholders could respond. So we can focus in again on, this is another interesting finding with regard to these newspapers, is if we focus in on the way that the Daily Telegraph covers Indonesia, mentioning the executions or not mentioning the executions, what's interesting at the outset to us, and for the sake of time I'll kind of power through this, is that the Daily Telegraph is a little more, well, it stays the course when it comes to presenting Indonesia, either during the execution time or making reference to the execution or not making reference to the execution. So you see some shifts in the way that things get covered. For instance, you see, okay, well, a little more negative emotion is statistically relevant, but overall, there's not much statistically relevant difference between the coverage of the executions in Indonesia more generally. So you might say that the Daily Telegraph actually holds the course. And lastly, this is in stark contrast to the way the Sydney Morning Herald covers execution Indonesia versus non-execution Indonesia. And what you see is there's a vast difference. There's a gigantic shift in the way that they cover Indonesia, depending on whether the execution, whether they're talking about the execution or not. And what's interesting here is it harks back to what I pointed out with regard to emotion, if you remember. They came more into line. So here we have some of the first nuanced understandings of what happens in the coverage. Now let's look at the Jawa Post. Let's look at the Jawa Post and walk through. Now, the first thing that you can see is the coverage of Australia is the difference isn't as profound between the Jawa Post and Compass. They're actually quite similar, more similar than the Sydney Morning Herald and the Daily Telegraph. In fact, there's only one bit of statistical relevance here, and that is certainty. So once again, we have, if you will, the slightly right-leaning paper. It's more centrist right, the Jawa Post is, but they're certain, as is the Daily Telegraph, but otherwise they're quite closely aligned with one another. Coverage of Australia during the Bali 9 execution period, focusing specifically on how the Jawa Post covers execution or not execution. What's really interesting to us is that ultimately there's not much difference. Similar to the Daily Telegraph, that the Jawa Post actually is a center-right paper, close to the center, actually holds the course in a similar way that the Daily Telegraph holds the course. There's an increase in cognitive processes, so they do provide in-depth analysis, but that's not shocking. And once again, with Compass, you see that there's a similar kind of thing happening as did with the Sydney Morning Herald. So this left-leaning paper, if you will, actually sees a huge shift in the coverage. There's a significant change in the way that, if you will, the left-leaning, more in-depth paper covers the election. And there was, but of course, they become more certain whenever they are discussing the execution. Okay. But one slide wasn't there, or we accidentally skipped over it. One thing that was also interesting to us is that you would actually expect throughout that Compass would provide the more in-depth analysis of Australia, but in fact, almost full stop, it's the Jawa Post. And the Jawa Post outstretches Compass in terms of depth of analysis and cognition, and that increases too with the execution coverage. So just heading briefly into the discussion period, because I know we're short for time, maybe Rose can flag a couple of points and then we'll get chatting to each other.
Sorry, I'll zoom through this really quick because I'm conscious of time. As well as doing the Luke stuff, we ran 4 focus groups, so 3 we ran in Indonesia and 1 in Australia. And a lot of the stuff that came out from the focus groups, I guess, are things that we already know or assume. So I'm going to zoom through some of the key points and then talk about, as researchers, where we're kind of interested in looking into it a little bit deeper. So, quickly, how was the Australian-Indonesian relationship viewed? Not unexpectedly with ambivalence, but they talked a lot about it being quite emotional and fiery when there is a crisis. So there was a quote one of our love me today, forget me tomorrow. So when there is a crisis, there's a lot of emotion. It's very fiery, but it's not as if it's in the psyche of everyone in their everyday lives until there's a reason to think about it. In terms of some of the key perceived issues that came out of the focus groups, lack of recognition of Indonesia's complexity, and I think that was some of these issues have come out with the focus group that you talked about, Richard. So that recognition of diversity and complexity of Indonesia's culture, the differences between the two cultures. There was this sense of some of our participants talked about Indonesia being this it's organised chaos, and you can't just come in and understand it. You've got to really spend time to get a handle on understand the culture, and that Australians haven't tried in a way that Indonesians understand. There was talk about respect and power, that once again is similar to Richard, that there wasn't the sense that Australia perhaps gave Indonesia as much respect. And then essentially there was a trust issue and recognition of the important role of media. Zooming through this, it's a lot more detailed in the report if you're interested. I'm going really fast. But in terms of how Australians and Indonesians view each other, not unexpectedly drawing a lot on stereotypes. But one of the things we were really interested in was that a lot of the stereotypes, so drawing from Agnieszka's work, was of the Asian other, but also in reverse it was about Australians being lumped with other Westerners. And so, they talked about them not really seeing that much difference between Australia and Brits in the US. And the feeling that, Australia will just follow US politically anyway. So in terms of Australia's autonomy, that was one of the things that they raised. That was raised as an issue. The other things. And also, in terms of discussions about stereotypes about Australians, it was a lot about, white foreigners. And this leads us to the idea, the research thing that we thought was quite interesting coming out of these focus groups was that of national identity. And Indonesia and Australia, I guess, are similar in that they're very young nations, and we're still coming to terms with what our identity is. And what's interesting is, how do we identify ourselves as Australians, but then how is this identity seen from outside as well? Is it the sort of older traditional Anglo-Australian identity that people refer to when they think of these stereotypes? Or is there a shift towards looking at Australians as a more of a multicultural Australian identity? And then how does this understanding of these, whether we look at it as an Anglo-Australian identity or a multicultural Australian identity, how does this then influence our sense of difference, perceived difference of other? And does this actually, is this a sort of direction we can look at in how we start taking our focus away from the difference between the two cultures and start focusing on the similarities? And it was one of the quotes from one of our participants talked about how, this was one of our Indonesian participants, talked about how she felt more of a foreigner in other Asian countries than she did in Australia, and that there was so much focus on the difference rather than the similarities between the two. And perhaps this changing identity of multicultural versus an Anglo-Australian identity, maybe that can help sort of bring the conversation towards the similarities in future research. So that was sort of the thing that we were really interested in as researchers going forward. So that was done in 2 seconds, I think.